hello all, and welcome to The New World is Virtual and Podcasting is King. Start producing like a pro. We've got a wonderful conversation to kick off for you today. Hope you all are enjoying lunch. Happy for us to be able to give you a little bit of gift there as part of being involved with our program today. So just a real quick little housekeeping. We are recording, and so that means that those of you that are joining us today will have an opportunity to view or visit the archive version afterwards. If you miss a note, don't worry about it. I want to mention to you that in that chat box, happy to have you post any questions, any comments, any ideas, anything like that would be excellent. If you do want to do a question, you can also, on your navigational bar, you'll see a Q&A, and you can certainly enter a question in there, and we will get to it as the program goes on. Any questions or comments that we are unable to answer during this time, we will gladly get that back to each and every one of you. So thank you for joining us, and I'm going to ask our excellent president, Lisa Koster, to jump on now and introduce our speaker. Lisa.
Thank you, Peggy. I'm Lisa Koster, the president of the chapter. Thank you for joining us today at PRSA Maryland for our webinar this Friday. As you know, podcasting is king right now. If you enjoy this type of thing, on Monday we will be kicking off our weekly chat series during this COVID-19 crisis, taking place throughout the month of April and May. So Monday's weekly chat is a virtual idea swap. It's about coping with COVID-19. So please come back on Monday, same time, 12:15, and we will do one each week. And the topics will really be based on what the audience tells us. With no further ado, let me welcome Matej Harangozo. He is with us today from Open Source Entertainment to talk to us about podcasting, why it's important, how you can do it, the logistics, the pricing, etc. So Matej, it's yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Lisa. So let me go ahead and share my screen real quick and launch my quick presentation that I put together. And I'm going to start off by saying, this is the first slide, which is the introduction to podcasting. But let me know when you see the presentation. Here we go. So Before I start, I do want to say to the conversation we had earlier is that, podcasting is becoming very popular now, not just to build a personal brand, but also to add a personal flavor to any company out there. So, there's a lot of podcasts popping up left and right. So it's getting a little saturated, which can be taken care of by creative marketing. But it is one of those tools that a business should consider using, sort of what Facebook was like 8 years ago when businesses were wondering, why should I be on Facebook? What is Facebook? What is this all hype about Facebook? And now every business virtually is on Facebook. And if you're not, you're probably not able to take advantage of any type of, business online. Podcasts are going to sort of become fairly similar. So I'm going to get into it, and let's discuss the type of podcasts that are out there, because I think it's also become sort of a broad term. But generally, podcasts are audio only, right? Ones you can find on your Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, or Alexa. We talked about that a second ago as well. You guys will start seeing that if you ask certain questions about any topic, and if a piece of relevant information is out there, an excerpt from a podcast, that will come up on these audio devices. And then of course, every other streaming or podcast streaming platform that's going to be out there is going to be able to provide these audio only podcasts, including some satellite radio and other streaming platforms. Then we have audio and video. I think that's the way to go in 2020. It's very beneficial to have yourself on video, just like I'm right now. I think, listeners and people appreciate being able to see you in person, even though they're just listening in the car when they get home, or, every once in a while they can tune in on the video format. And, that way you can get your podcast on all the audio platforms, but you can also have it on YouTube or Patreon or similar. Or, you can you can live stream your podcast now on Facebook Live or YouTube Live. Again, your consumers or your fans can see you through the video, and then later that audio recorded version can just be distributed through all the podcast platforms that are out there. The next thing to consider is like I mentioned earlier, is it live or is it pre-recorded, right? Simply said, if it's going to be live, it's just going to take a lot more resources to put that together correctly, not just, being able to have a sufficient Wi-Fi speeds and, electricity running without interruption at whatever location you're at, but you're probably also going to need a engineer on site because it's going to be a little bit more complex since you want the audio to be sort of pre-mastered or at the levels that is going to be sufficient enough for a lot of these different platforms and for the listeners to have a great experience. I would suggest that you have a way to rehearse prior to the show or sort of onboard your guests if you will have any guests. So that's something you have to consider. Having these protocols in place is a must, especially for when you go live. Just imagine any type of news, TV broadcast or anything similar, right? Is the visual may not be that sophisticated, or doesn't have to be since it's a podcast, but still preparation is necessary. And a lot of these other technical aspects are going to be a little bit more complex to deal with if it's live. If it's pre-recorded, it's easier. You could start with just a simple microphone. You have a lot more flexibility of doing post-production edits on it. For people, especially for people that would love to get started with podcasting but are not comfortable in front of a camera or a mic, this is the way I would recommend starting. I would assume most people would agree with that. And also for pre-recorded podcasts, you don't necessarily have to have an engineer if you can figure out how to run it yourself. And it's also easier to deal with. One thing I'm going to mention later on, like licensing other content. If you happen to put songs in your podcast or any other audio that's not yours originally, you have to consider that in both formats. And then, of course, structuring your podcast to begin with is very important because, you want to think about the theme, which is really sort of, branding. What's your podcast about? What are the principles behind the podcast? What's the backstory behind the company? Why was the podcast created? Then with that, of course, you have to consider your target audience, demographic, creating the structure for it. Is it going to have guests? Is it just you? Is it 30 minutes? Is it an hour and a half? Does it have potential to grow or expand? Is it once a week, once a month, whatever the case is? So that is important to consider, beforehand. Now, me as an entrepreneur, I'm a fan of just getting started and experimenting, especially if you feel comfortable in front of your consumers or your, potential new fans. Just get started and figure it out as you go. But for some bigger companies, let's say you're a company that has 100 employees, you have a sort of a brand to uphold already. You don't want to go, into the field as an amateur. So you're going to have to consider all these preparations and make sure you get it right. So the next slide is talking about the podcast technology. So we're going to spend some time here. And let's get into the basic home setup. So let me go to the next slide. And technology is my forte. I could talk about this all day long, but the basic home setup cost will be anywhere from $300 to $1,000. And honestly, for most people that have the budget to get started, I would even say is going to start at $500 because the microphone is not the only thing that you're going to need. Obviously, these costs, by the way, are assuming that you have a laptop or a computer already on site, right? If you don't, then that's another at least $1,500 to get a capable computer. If it's brand new, maybe a little bit less if it's used to be able to handle podcasting. But, like I said, it's not just going to be the microphone, but if you're doing it on video, you may have to consider the lighting in the room and, you may have to get some acoustical treatment if it's in the big room or anything like that. But let's go through these pictures. So the one at the top right is literally just a laptop with a USB microphone. That's probably going to be the cheapest setup. It's going to sound similar to the microphone that I'm using. I mean, at the end of the day, to the consumer, a lot of times they, unless they're like a professional audio engineer, they're not going to know the difference if you use the correct recording software with that microphone. But that microphone is quality, and that's about, I think it goes for like 170. And again, you'd have to have a laptop. That's the most basic setup to get started with, and this would accommodate any type of audio only podcast. Then when we go down to the bottom right or the bigger picture on the left, obviously you see you got multiple channels. You have a mixing board, so you can maybe plug in like an external audio source if you want to, infuse a song or just any audio source into your podcast, whether it's during the show or post-production. You may need multiple inputs. And at the end of the day, the cost will scale with the amount of audio channels. I have a recording studio for musicians, so all the equipment that I have is overkill for a podcast scenario. But like the microphone I'm using right now, if you can see it on camera, this is $1,000 condenser microphone. There's no reason to use $1,000 condenser microphone. However, you do want to use a condenser microphone for podcasts. And, a decent one is going to run you at least $200. So if you need 4, because you may have 3 guests, is going to go roughly up $300 per channel or per microphone, because you also have to have an interface. And these little mixing boards that you see, they're also acting as interfaces. One thing I will show you as well, which is very important in the chain of your technology, like this is a simple one I have at the house. Let me see the camera. I have to get rid of my background. Give me 1 second. If that's even possible while I'm presenting. I'm not. So interface, and unfortunately don't see the boxes. Can you see it? There we go. It's a piece of hardware that goes in between your computer and a microphone, which will make the microphone sound a little bit better, because sometimes you need pre-amplification for the sound to sound crisp and to perform certain functions. And then once you get into that, you're going to be dealing with software that you have to use. You could simply use Zoom. Like what we're doing right now, because I have a professional condenser microphone running through the Focusrite 2, it's a 4-channel interface into my computer. Once this podcast is recorded, right, is going to be exported in a video format. I could take that entire file and I could just separate the audio out of that, and it's going to sound pretty damn good if you wanted to just upload it on some of these podcast platforms. So, Zoom is a basic podcast setup. If you want to use it, even if it doesn't have video, you could use it. But really recommended would be to use something like Pro Tools or Adobe Audition. Adobe Audition is like the household name for podcasting, but if you know a little bit about music production or you messed around with GarageBand before, even GarageBand could work on your Mac. OBS is another software which is open source and it's free, that you could use, that will accommodate the recording of audio as well as video and multiple video screens. OBS will also allow you to go live on Facebook and YouTube if you wanted to use that. And then I'll finish off the home studio setup by saying that you want to use is sort of a smaller space, make sure it's carpeted and has least amount of windows as possible. The carpet sort of creates acoustical attenuation, or it doesn't create reverb, put it that way. If you have a large room and you have nothing on the walls, the sound is going to start bouncing around and sort of create reverb. So if that's the case, you're going to have to get acoustical pads, which you could get on eBay. They're pretty cheap. But again, that goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's not just the microphone that you may have to get. You may have to get some, few pads, or treat your room accordingly so it sounds pretty decent. The example right here is a room that we took at one of my past clients' homes. And you see originally it was just like a small, it's a master bedroom. It has 1 window in it. This was the beginning before how do you go back? Let me escape, go back to that. Sorry about that. It was a basic room, which later on we treated for acoustics a little bit. Then she has this white background that you could see. Obviously this one had a video aspect to it, or the video portion to it as well. And it was sort of a show, but it did have both components. The audio only went on all the podcasting platforms, and her video portion was displayed on YouTube. These are just screenshots of what the final show looked like. And I can actually, let me end this again. I can show you a quick video of what that looks like. If you guys can hear it properly.
One miracle after the other.
Can you tell me about the song? How all of that came up to be? And can you tell us maybe
So I'm going to stop that right there, but it just gives you an idea of, if you spend a little extra money and set it up, there's a lot more content that you will end up with that you could use to, market your company, market your brand, or whatever you're using your podcast for, right? So, and again, it could go the little bit more advanced home setup, which is the slide we're on now, that could cost anywhere between, $2,500 to $9,000. Her setup, which I'll have the entire Excel sheets that breaks down the cost and the equipment. I'll have it at the end of this presentation. You will see all the different pieces that went into it, but hers was closer to $9,000. We had 2 cameras, 2 different angles. There was 3 different microphones being recorded at the same time. There were condenser cavalier microphones, which you see, the clip-ons on the shirt like they would have on TV shows. So that, drives up the cost as well. But this could all be done at a house or a small office space. And then the last one where we're going to get into the equipment, here we go. Here's the interface. So this is a 8-channel interface. Actually an 18-channel interface, 4 channels in the front with preamps, which is a larger, more expensive version of the one that I showed you. The one that I had is $250. This 18-channel one, I think it's about $500. The picture right here for the setup that we just saw on the screen, these are the condenser microphones that we use. We purchased 3 of them. I believe those run for $200 a piece, and those are some of the cheapest Cavalier wireless condenser microphones you can buy. And then, of course, we had 2 DSLR cameras that provided the video angles. So you could see, this whole setup, this whole kit was about $1,000. So you could see how that could quickly drive up the costs. Let's move forward to the professional studio setup. So this is actually a studio in Washington, D.C. in a commercial office space that I set up for a client. And you see that we have a separate room that has the main seat for the host of the podcast, and then 3 separate microphones for up to 3 guests. This actually was audio only, at least the shows that were produced out of this particular studio, and they accommodated local politicians in Washington, D.C. Actually a few congressmen and women had shows through this podcast studio. And this one was audio only, but you see the way the room is set up, there's no problem getting cameras in there and additional lighting necessary for a video component. And at the bottom left, you'll see there's a much bigger mixing board, which accommodates up to 16 channels. The client already had this in place. In my opinion, that's overkill for a podcast scenario as well. You don't really need any more than 8 channels, but a digital mixing board, which has all the compression and all the tools within that piece of hardware that are necessary to properly mix and master the podcast when it's going live, it's all in there. That one runs for about $2,000. And this setup, you see there's a phone on the left as well. This also accommodated a guest being able to call in from anywhere. So they didn't have to call in through Skype or through Zoom. They can actually call through a regular phone line live. And for that, you need additional equipment like a server and another hardware box that, can patch in these phone calls with from a real line. So, all these costs can go up. If you were to put together a studio like this in a commercial space, it's probably going to run you around $15,000 just in the equipment, if not $20,000, and then probably additional $5,000 to set it up, considering that you don't really have to, do any structural reconstruction of the office space. You see that there's a gap right here for a window, which they never really incorporated into the show. And in my opinion, if you had a setup like this, you might as well spend the extra money, put the window in there properly. So that way, when the engineer is communicating with the host and the podcast is running live or is even being pre-recorded for a post-produced show, they're communicating through headphones and microphone, right? In this case, whoever was in this control room, which is the room down here at the left, bottom left corner, would have to been super, super quiet, especially, during a live broadcast, which is not ideal. So you want to have that separation from the engineer and the area where the podcast is being recorded. So let me make sure I covered all the points on the technology aspect. When it comes to video, of course, like I said, lighting is very important. So that's a whole other thing to consider. And if you have an audio engineer that you hired to run a facility like this, they may not necessarily be most experienced in video production. That's a situation we faced with another podcast setup that we had. So that client had to hire 2 separate professionals. One, which was the engineer on site that understood all the audio production capability, the post-production, mixing and mastering, and then a separate video guy who was running the live video feed and the lighting and everything associated with it. So let's move to, because I know we don't have too much time here. Let's get into the post-production aspect of it. And let me check the chat to see if we have any questions.
Yes, thanks. I'm glad you have a pause, Matej. I've got a question for you. What affordable method or tool would you recommend for an in-house production to record a call-in guest to do more of a remote interview? She says, I know the sound quality won't be great, but our guests might not have the technical skills to do anything but call in on their phone. So can I make that interview sound its best on a small budget?
Yeah, so what I would recommend in that case is using something like Google Hangout, because when you create a Google Hangout meeting, it does provide you with a conference call number to call in, and you can patch a Google Hangout feed through something like OBS, which is free software. And, the sound quality is going to sound just like you would hear somebody from a phone. But if you're getting it into OBS, which is the software, you can at least turn it up, right? So it would just sound like a regular phone call, but you could turn up the volume so it wouldn't, you wouldn't be dealing with that issue. But honestly, if you can push your guests to join through something like Zoom or Skype, I think the audio is going to be way better, even if the client or the guest is going to just end up using their laptop microphone or their computer microphone. So if they're able to, but I think Google Hangout would be a good option because that can accommodate an actual phone call.
And Matej, one other question. This is not necessarily completely related, but I think it's a good one because we got some folks on the phone who are really interested in how they may not want to do a podcast, but they certainly want to get their clients, for example, on a podcast. Do you have any sense, because you're doing these podcasts, of what you'd be looking for, or if you heard what someone would be looking for to pitch a guest to join you for a show, like say something around COVID-19, for example?
Right. That's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of different answers to that, but it's sort of part of like PR work. It's the same way as if, and I know Lisa has a very experience with this. If she has a client and she wants to pitch their story to Fox 45, news, or pitch their story to the newspaper, right? So you have to find the relevant podcast show. And generally, the bigger the show, they have a queue in place. So you have to, pitch your story, pitch your professional background and why you're the expert, why they may want you on their show, if their show even accommodates, guests, and then potentially get on the waiting list, unless, of course, you are requested to come on. But if you were to seek to be on podcast as a person, or you have a client and you're a PR person and you want to get your client a bunch of podcasts, you have to first start with searching for the relevant ones. And I would recommend that you go on Spotify or Apple, Podcasts, or Google Podcasts, on one of these major platforms, because you at least want to make sure that podcast has the ability to be distributed to, to the majority of the podcast listeners, because those are the platforms they are using. Does that answer it?
Sounds like it does, and we'll ask other attendees also to jump on the chat if you've got any additional ideas and suggestions. Thanks for giving us that pause, Matej. I'll let you go back to it.
Sure, and we'll get back to promotion and how to tackle promoting your own podcast, or potentially getting yourself on a podcast for to promote your business. This is another to finish this off, this is another professional studio. So this is actually my studio, which is a music studio that is now in a different facility. But I had a podcast that had a video component as well. And you see we have 3 screens. So we had to make sure that the cameras were always set up properly before the podcast started. We had a lot of different, tripods in place, extra computers that were running different feeds. My podcast also incorporated music. But like I said, the studio setup you're seeing on the left screen in the picture, that's overkill for a podcast. It's not necessary at all, but could definitely make a very good sounding podcast. And we were basically just utilizing the equipment we already had, which majority of the microphones we have in the studio are over $500. But like I said, you don't need to go that high. Matter of fact, the most popular widely used podcast microphone, even for the professionals out there, is, I think, peaks at $500. So I would never spend $1,000 on a podcast microphone. It's not necessary whatsoever. So let's get into post-production, because this is important to consider, right? So when it's audio only, then you do want to have it sort of mix and mastered. is not heavy lifting. I mean, there's no heavy lifting really done on mixing and mastering, just regular conversational audio piece. But I guess what you want to consider in post-production more is editing of the podcast. Mainly, do you want to infuse additional pre-roll material, right? Pre-roll is before the show starts. You hear a lot of podcasts have like some type of a jingle or an introductory piece of audio that comes in first. Sometimes you have mid-roll audio that goes in and post-roll. And this is also where you get into advertising. Once your podcast becomes big enough, that's how podcasts charge for advertising space. That's the sort of the standard way of looking at it. You have a pre-roll space, mid-roll, and post-roll. And it could work either by you as the company pre-recording what you want to be played on the podcast, sort of like a radio station playing a commercial in between songs, or, which is more popular in my opinion, and I think it's a better way to advertise anyways, is that you send the podcast host your product and they'll get to hopefully intelligently speak about your product and your brand during the podcast. They sort of just introduce it into the conversation, right? And if it happens to be a mid-roll, which is the most expensive slot for podcasts, then obviously, you want to also make sure that the podcaster, the podcasting host is, I would say they're genuinely liking your product, right? Because a lot of podcasters get in trouble by just being a sellout. At the end of the day, they'll advertise anything, and I think the consumer knows. But again, it really depends on the show. It depends on the theme of the show, right? But those are the sort of things you want to consider in getting the audio edited, whether you're writing your own podcast or if you wanted to potentially get anything to another podcaster to play. So audio post-production is important. And obviously when you're doing it live, it brings on that extra complexity. All of that has to be either pre-scripted or the engineer has to know when it's going to be in there. You have a timesheet literally that you have to follow minute by minute, and everybody involved in that live show, generally the host, knows exactly what cues to follow during that podcast. And even the guests that come on are sort of prepped. I don't know if anybody's ever been on a podcast, but if not, and you want to get on the podcast, what sort of happens is you always get there an hour early, and the podcast producer tells you the process of when you're going to come in, when you should speak, when you should not speak. They'll give you sort of not a roster, but like an outline for the day of how the podcast is going to be running and so on and so forth. So that's all important just in the audio aspect of it. Obviously video, when you get to that, the video engineer is going to consider the color correction, splicing and transitioning, the different, angles. If there are multiple angles, if it's just one angle, then again, you want to consider infusing other video material in there, whether it's pre-roll, mid-roll, or post-roll. And then, you want to make sure that you get the correct file size out of it, both audio and video, right? These digital distribution platforms or places like YouTube and, Patreon, they have specific formats of files that they will take. So that all has to be considered. And lastly, formatting when it comes to video, right? Because YouTube is widescreen. So you want to, for example, only record video for YouTube, or sometimes you want to take that and post-produce it into square videos that have horizontal writing at the top or bottom, introducing the topic of the idea. And those are very popular for Instagram or Facebook or even LinkedIn. And then, of course, we have the new format, which is becoming more and more popular, which is vertical. So when I was doing my podcast, I also had it was the latest Galaxy Note phone, which was good enough for the video, in my opinion. I had a vertical video recording the entire podcast from a particular angle of the room. So that way, when we put snippets of the podcast up on our IGTV page, or you can also do, 15-second advertising formats for like IG stories or other social media platforms that take that format, that it's important to, consider that beforehand so you can sort of have a decent vertical looking video portion of any of the podcasts, so it doesn't look weird because you're trying to squish the widescreen version into it. So that's definitely something that should be considered in video, and even before you start producing your show, where it's going to be eventually and where do you want to get it through, which social media platform do you want to use these snippets to advertise your podcast. And then let's talk about branding and the polished product, right? Because this is, again, will determine a lot how you can market your podcast. Because Peggy brought up a good point before the webinar started, is that, how do you know which podcasts are popular? It seems like it's getting pretty saturated. There's a lot of podcasts out there, and that is true. It's sort of becoming like blogs out there. Anybody can write a blog, but it doesn't mean you're going to end up on the first page of, Google search when somebody searches for that topic. So you have to advertise and market your blog. If you're going to be willing to spend any amount of money to start, doing a podcast, you should consider at least a, small, tiny monthly budget to advertise that podcast or the show. And then you can literally advertise on Facebook for $1.50 a day, right? So that would be, around $50 a month if you wanted to do it at the minimum level. But that is something to consider. And when it comes to, branding, you want to know, like, it's not just what the podcast is about, but you have to consider the episode artwork. Because when you start uploading it, we're going to get into that in the next slide for distribution networks. When you start uploading it to Apple Podcast or Spotify or Google or any digital distribution platform that accommodates podcasts, you may want to have, a different piece of artwork for each episode. There's your general branded artwork that talks about the podcast, right? There's many different formats. Again, you're going to have square pictures. You're going to have the different widescreen formats for maybe your YouTube, if you have it on YouTube again, or SoundCloud. SoundCloud is another popular one that I didn't really mention, but SoundCloud really spearheaded the popularity of a lot of podcasts, just like it did for musicians. And getting back to, marketing your brand and product is what I also told Peggy in the beginning, is that it is getting saturated, and it's sort of the same kind of theory or mentality as musicians, right? There's a lot of musicians out there, a lot of talented musicians, but unless you have a major label behind you, or you have a lot of money and understand the music business to market your brand, your songs, your music, and associate yourself with, bigger celebrities or, influencer marketers or influencers out there, it's going to be very hard for your music to become the most, popular in its genre, for example. So the product, when it's finished, should be marketed, because otherwise you're going to, in my opinion, you're going to get lost in the sea of all these different podcasts that are coming online potentially every single day. So let's go to the next slide. I want to make sure we're good on time. Okay. So distribution and marketing, how to get your podcast online. Just like musicians can utilize different platforms to get their music online, the most popular ones for podcasts are Buzzsprout, Podbean, Acast, Midroll, which also accommodates ads. So as your podcast grows, Midroll, somebody from Midroll from the company may reach out to you and say, oh, we see you're getting X amount of downloads per month. And we see that you're in this particular genre of thought or this genre of, information. Would you be willing to consider advertisers putting their products or whatever they want on your show, right? So that's something to consider. Otherwise you have to have your own team to source the different interests from potential businesses or anyone that would eventually ever want to advertise on your podcast. So, and you can always switch digital distributors. But there's, many out there, and they sort of change. But when I started doing podcasts and started kind of diving into that industry, Buzzsprout has been and Acast and Stitcher. Don't let me forget to mention Stitcher. Stitcher, Buzzsprout, and Acast have been around for a very long time. So, anytime you consider a digital distributor or even a piece of software or a company, kind of want to ask yourself, how long have they been around? Because if you're ever going to need support to either get your, piece of hardware fixed or have an issue with distribution, you want to make sure that company itself doesn't go out of business. Because same way as podcasts spur up every single day potentially, and also die off probably every single day, that can sometimes happen with these bigger companies as well. How do you distribute video? So again, the platforms that I mentioned before are strictly for the audio aspect of it. The video distribution can happen through YouTube. It can happen through Patreon or similar websites. You can also embed your YouTube videos into your own website if you have a website. Podia.com is another similar platform to Patreon. So there's many, different ways. Vimeo is another one. There's many different ways of getting your video out there. What I would say in this particular section is that, again, consider copyright laws and licensing, both for audio and video, because the last thing you want to do is get your video version of your podcast online. And let's say you used your favorite Aerosmith song in the beginning or in the middle because of some topic you were talking about. Last thing you want is for YouTube to take it down because you didn't have the right license of using that Aerosmith song, right? So consider getting licenses from the people or from any content that you're going to be using on your podcast. And that goes for video as well. Let's go down to what marketing you should focus on and why. So, this is a topic I could also talk about for hours, but again, understand who your demographic is. That's going to be very important in the beginning. So, where your audience hangs out at most and also how to market, but direct to consumer marketing is probably the best and cheapest way, and especially through social media, right? So where you can run ads on Facebook, Instagram, even on YouTube. You can now run ads even on Spotify and Apple Music. Apple Music is much tougher, but any business or even consumer can run ads on Spotify. Now, if you've never used these platforms, it's either you're going to learn how to use them, experiment, and do it yourself, or you hire a digital marketing company or agency or a PR agency that's experienced in these things to do that for you. So that's the cheapest way to get the word out there about your podcast and to drive traffic to these major podcast distribution platforms like Apple Podcasts or Spotify and whatnot. The second type of digital marketing can be influencer marketing. Just make sure that the influencer you're going to reach out to that's going to talk about your podcast is aligned with your particular, topic of things that you talk about. And also, one thing I want to mention about influencer marketing, because I also own a digital marketing agency in the music industry, is that you want to make sure you don't get scammed by influencers. Not necessarily flat out scam that you pay them money and they're not going to, advertise your podcast. But what I mean by that is that a lot of influencers these days inflate their popularity by, purchasing fake engagement and traffic on their accounts to make themselves look way bigger than they are. And then they try to charge accordingly to businesses and others that want to advertise through their influence. So, influencer marketing can be very, very good and useful. Just be very aware of that aspect of, of them trying to, paint a different picture than what the reality is. And again, if you work with a experienced PR or marketing agency, they should be able to, navigate through all those issues. And then, of course, we got traditional ways of marketing, guerrilla marketing, which is outside passing out flyers or download cards, right? If you're going to make any stickers or flyers for your podcast and leave them any, different spots where you think your particular listener hangs out at, make sure you have a QR code. Especially for the younger demographics, anybody can scan a QR code these days, and that QR code can take them directly to your podcast page, or there are platforms out there that you can get these QR codes managed through, where they would literally open up. Let's say you already have Spotify on your phone and you scan your sticker, it'll bring up Spotify with your show and your latest episode directly on their phone instantly. So that's a pretty creative and decent way of marketing your podcast as well. And then we got 7 minutes left. So let me just kind of leave it at cost. This is going to be the last slide, cost and budgeting. And I've sort of touched on that a little bit. Here's the entire breakdown of that one client where we did like sort of a advanced home setup, which was around $9,000. But let me talk about third-party studio rates, because I know that's going to be probably a popular question. You should expect to pay anywhere between $40 to $75 per hour of production, right? Now, obviously, you're not only going to pay for the hour that you're recording, but you may have to pay for an hour before and an hour or 2 hours after, depending on how much time is necessary for post-production. And, the setup, the initial setup and preparation for the podcast. A lot of podcast-only studios charge they have monthly packages. So, for example, if you're paying $1,000 a month, that can accommodate, let's say, 3 30-minute shows per month. If you have a higher package, it could accommodate, X amount of shows. Again, it's based on the amount of minutes of the show being recorded. And some studios, of course, also accommodate the video aspect of it. So that's sort of what you should, expect to pay at a professional studio. If you're running this from home, other than getting your initial hardware, there's not much to really consider except, of course, your utility costs, electricity, or maybe if you're getting a lot of guests coming in to your house to be interviewed as guests, maybe you should consider like liability insurance, right? And maybe getting a quick LLC set up so that way, if God forbid an object in your house falls on somebody's head and they get injured and you get sued, you're sort of protected. And then if you're going to hire your own staff, if you're a business and you want to hire your own staff, I would say to get a competent, knowledgeable audio engineer, you can expect to pay anywhere between $20 to $35 an hour. That's what I pay my audio engineers. And then the video, again, it could be in the same range, and you're going to have to kind of budget accordingly. If you think you're going to be doing one show every week, and one show with everything considered is going to take, let's say, 5 hours from the audio engineer and 3 hours from the video guy, then you have to incorporate that into your budget, plus the cost of getting set up, and maybe additional costs if you have your setup in a commercial facility. So let me end it there because we have about 5 minutes, and I want to leave it for questions and answer a few more questions. Or we can stay on for a few minutes longer as long as we don't get kicked off by Zoom.
Thank you. Let me see. I don't have any opened questions that have come up, but there is a possibility that some of our folks here have an interest in asking a question. You can either type it in, or if you'd like, I can open up any lines for people to talk. Is there any questions? Let us know in the chat or in the Q&A.
Peggy, can we open everyone's microphone so people can just chat freely?
Yeah, let's see if we can do that. Hang on one second while I get back to our... Whoops.
Might get us more engaged.
Yeah. And
hi, David.
Hello.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, everybody. There we go. We had 2 others on who had to scoot out because of the time, but your mics are open, guys. What would you like to ask? So let me ask this question, because most of you came on the webinar today, I'm going to guess, with a specific thought in mind. Anybody want to share what drew them to this webinar and give us a sense of whether or not you, in fact, are already doing podcasting?
I personally have not, and I'm really not interested in starting a podcast. I was more interested in finding out what it would cost me to take a client to have a podcast produced, or, of course, if they wanted to be interviewed on a podcast, what that would involve. I've been interviewed on a couple of podcasts, and true to Matej's points, there was a lot of prep time involved. It was a great instruction sheet I received from the podcast producer, and just all the information about the proper mic. She really preferred I did not use my computer, but at least a headset of some sort. So I appreciate the information. I really found interesting, Matej, the pre-roll, mid-roll, and post-roll information with the advertising and such. I didn't realize that, so that was helpful for me. Thank you.
Yeah, not a problem. And, a lot of people want to start podcasts with the intention of, gaining some attention and a bunch of fans behind it. And that's essentially how you end up monetizing your podcast. If you have a lot of downloads of your podcast, that's one measure that's used in the industry of kind of gauging how popular your podcast is. You can charge based on that. And some of these major podcasters that are out there that have audiences in the millions, they can charge like $100,000 just for the mid-roll ad per show. So you could see that you can make a lot of money each show. But again, like I said, I think in my opinion, at least the podcaster should actually like the product and be a fan of it, so it fits it, especially if they're going to be talking about it. If they just run commercials like a radio station, generally those slots are much cheaper.
This is Dorothy. I have a question. What are there popular topics that I guess I'm trying to figure out, are there topics that are totally saturated, already being covered? Are there some unique topics that you think are out there, or more creative or different?
That's a good question. I think it's like a lot of content on, like radio or TV. From the latest data that I looked at when we were considering, creating this podcast studio at the facility where I'm at currently, we looked at what markets we would go after that could mostly benefit from this. The most popular show for podcasts are similar to what you see on TV, like reality TV shows or talking about reality TV shows. There's a lot of kind of like sports announcers. So the most traffic comes from, again, like entertainment, but you're also seeing a lot of interesting niches like, science or space exploration or, in my opinion, if I was pitching this to a business to do a podcast, I think you can literally create let's say your business creates ice cream. You could probably create a podcast about everything about ice cream, how it's made, the machinery that you have to purchase for your store. And if you advertise it to correct audience, you will, amass a certain fan base out of it, because it's so easy nowadays to utilize social media ad platforms to literally understand the interests that are out there in this world of what people are talking about and just target those audiences, so that I guarantee there's plenty of niche topics that people talk about, or just genres of like thought or genre of music or whatever. And there's also the more popular ones are pretty much going to be very similar to what you see, what's on TV or what's on YouTube. Is going to be more entertainment based from the data that I've seen.
Okay, thank you.
But actually, one of my old investors, his name is Pat Hyben. I don't know if any of you guys live in Howard County or in the Maryland area. But Pat Hyben was a big real estate agent probably a decade ago in the Howard County area. His real estate team still exists. So he now has a podcast just interviewing other real estate agents in the U.S., really around the world, that are crushing it. And, his audience is probably other real estate agents. But he now, at this point, he's been doing it for almost 5 years. He probably pulls in 6,000 listeners, per month. And when you're in that sort of a niche market, you can imagine that if a bank or, anybody that sells products to the real estate industry or to real estate agents, if they wanted to advertise on Pat Hyben's podcast or, pay to be on it, because you can also pay to be on a podcast instead of just telling them what to say about you, then, this is how you could create demand in a niche in that area, So let me know if you guys have any more questions. But yeah, I think, people should consider podcasts. And like I said, I'm a fan as an entrepreneur, just getting out there and trying it. So for as little as $500, you can get up and running tomorrow probably. Just watch a few, YouTube videos maybe on some common setup. And, it's not that difficult to start. I think it's just more difficult of staying consistent and marketing it out there to the right audience.
Peggy, hi, I have a question. With all of the cell phones and the new technology, is there a threat to sort of your professional industry in that anybody, maybe 10 years ago, we would need people like you to do this, and now anybody can kind of do it? Other than the sound quality, do you think that there's a threat to the overall professional podcasting industry, and whether or not agencies or businesses would be turning more to do it yourself as opposed to professional studios like yours?
Yeah, I certainly think there is. Lucky for me that this is not a major revenue stream for me. I have a music studio, which gets a lot of clients, and the podcast was something I did for myself on the side. And because I had engineers on staff, I had people reach out to me. We set up their studios. But I am certainly seeing that, right? Overall, the audio production and video production industry has taken a hit in the U.S. because you have websites like Fiverr. So let's say you even record, your podcast on site at the facility with professional video cameras, and you want the post-production done. You don't have to necessarily pay $75 an hour to a video editor here in the States. You can put it on Fiverr and get it done for $10 an hour, probably at the same quality. But then you also, have to consider the project management aspect of it, communicating with these people. So there's a lot of things to consider. And I think for a company, if it's a company that has people on staff that either are, you know, good at this because they see it as a hobby, or they have the money to hire an engineer, then they probably will figure out that there's, you know, some difficulty to this to do it the right way, and they will hire out or hire an agency. Obviously, you could do it through your phone, but you know, then it becomes about quality. Because I think quality, not just the audio, but of the content ends up mattering, right? And as you get bigger and bigger and you get more and more fans, I think a lot of the podcasters, even that started from their basement, that are now multimillionaires off of it, they eventually either ended up spending money on their in their own house and hiring professional engineers to be a part of that show, so they don't have to, you know, do everything themselves. Or if it's a bigger company, they probably will outsource it to a marketing agency that is already going to be handling their, you know, digital marketing or physical marketing and things like that.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Matej. Lisa, would you like to say anything else to close us off for a really good conversation?
No, thank you all very much for attending. Matej, I thank you for your time and your effort and your production and your producing and everything else you did for us today. I really appreciate the information. So
Sure.
thank you all. Have a wonderful Friday. Have a nice weekend despite the situation. And I think we're going to have Matej back for part 2 in a few months. I hope we'll get some more people engaged with us. So if you have any questions or information for us, please write us at info@prsamd.org. And we'll see you at a future webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for the invite. I enjoyed it, and everybody stay safe and healthy.
Yep.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Matej.
Thank you.